Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Silver Tempest, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be reviewing the Silver Tempest set review because we actually have Crown Zenith in just a couple weeks' time being released. I know it's not a full expansion where there are mostly reprint cards coming out from Crown Zenith, but there will be a tweak to the metagame, and although there are still tournaments ongoing in the Silver Tempest meta, I think we have a good picture of how these cards shaped up, and the channel is going to start working towards that Crown Zenith deck discussion and possibly even some gameplay in here as well before it reaches PTCGO. So let's get into it, where we will start off with Capturing Aroma, and my face is going to pop up just here, hello, and we're going to go through the ratings of cards, starting off with, like I said, this Capturing Aroma. Actually saw a little bit of play towards the latter stages of this format in Lugia, adding to the 4 Ultra, 4 Quick, 4 Incense that we already had in the list. And I do think those are always guaranteed in Lugia. I think no one wants to budge from those 12 slots. But Capturing Aroma can end up being slot 13, 14, 15 in some cases to just add to your outs. Now, I'm not a huge fan of it personally. I know you're going to say that it's a win-win situation no matter what the flip, but that's not really true, and you're kidding yourself if you think that's right. So it is just about creeping into Lugia, but I would expect it to not be in the majority of lists. So we're still going to rate this quite low. It's a great card to have in mind for post-rotation, though. I don't think there's anything really from Zenith that necessarily needs this card. So I'm still going to give it 2-star rating for experimentation, but almost never actually making the cut in successful Lugias, and I still think that's going to be the case going forward. Quadstone hasn't seen any play, so it is going to be that 1-star card. I don't think much is going to change there. There is some arguments around this being a really good card for some Gardevoir EX decks when Scarlet and Violet comes out, because it could be a combo alongside Mewtwo v Union. It could even be a combo alongside Mewtwo v Union right now, but it doesn't really have the draw engine to back it up. Possibly there's something you can do there. But I think it's overall very niche and not seeing play in Standard. Camo Poncho probably was that 2-star, maybe a little bit less. I know it's been in some Crobat Weezings, and Weezing itself is on the fringes of being competitive right now, so I think 2 is more or less fair for experimentation, but I don't expect much of this going forward, and I think we've already seen 2 better Weezing-based decks in the Quad Weezing and Eternatus Weezing, neither of which play the Poncho, so we'll give it that 2 for experimentation, but that's really as far as it goes. I think I'd be very surprised if we saw any Eldegoss Cheryl loops at this stage. I think there's better control decks that have come to light within this format already, so I don't really expect a Cheryl looping VMAX deck to do all that well, especially because we have 1-hit KO potential from Amazing Ray, which really invalidates the sort of tank strategies that are currently being messed around with right now. Earthen Tablet, well, I'll probably put down to 1-star. I think Urshifu hasn't even had a look in really in this format, which is a strange thing to say because it's normally over time found a way to creep into that metagame and find a niche, but it's not really done so, at least just yet. Lugia is just too much hard work for it, alongside Mew being very popular, and Jolteon is far away from being a strong enough card. And just Manaphy's all over the place, right? We've got Raikou, we've got Greninja in Lost Box players' decks. We've still got a little hint of Palkia. There's just lots of spread around, so there's been a lot of reason to play Manaphy, obviously like Reggie decks and such, so that just hurts these sort of spread decks. Obviously this is placing counters, the tablet itself, but it means you can't really capitalize on those counters being placed, and by that same merit there's not many decks that are like very heavy V decks. Even when you think about Lugia, it often tries to put like one Lugia down and then a fish can bounce anyway, so you're not really getting any value from a sort of spread attack in the game right now, unless it's like direct damage spread. Emergency Jelly, we did rate that 1-star. It's obviously had that breakout performance of catching the Lugias sleeping, or in this case being paralyzed, of course, by having that very niche combo alongside the Articuno. It was kind of that one-and-done thing as soon as it's revealed itself as an option. Now we're seeing Birdkeeper Eldegoss or just Birdkeeper in Lugia decks. We've already seen Espeon VMAX and a few other things you can put into the Lugia, so it kind of was that 1 week punt option where you cash in on your deck being ahead of the field. And now I think it's pretty poor. A few people around the globe, all on the same weekend, came up with the same idea, though, with Zekrom, with Articuno, with a few other things that obviously self-damage, and the jelly keeps them in that lock, mostly with the Articuno, of course, for the jelly in particular. So we'll give it that 3-star for being a success in a deck, but you would now call that deck probably low tier because it loses to Teched Lugias, which now we're aware of the issue is a problem, and I think going forward it's still gonna only ever see play in a combination with these sorts of tech attackers. Grove Tablet is certainly that 5-star card. Mew has been, I think, solidly, at least in popularity, the top 3 decks. Its performances have been kind of strange. It's had a decent number of high placements, but has really suffered in the latter half. I think ever since the Mewtwo v Union win with Piper, there's been reason for Drapion to be in Lugia, there's been reason for Drapion to be in Lost Box, and that's just too volatile for Mew. But that said, Grove Tablet has seen success with the Mew, and actually it has seen success with the Vikavolt, so I'm glad I got this on the slide, where you can use this to be a combo enabler item for you, because you don't really have a V-Star power to use, unless you're using Aerodactyl's V-Star in exactly the Lugia matchup. So, yeah, very strong card. Is still a driving force in Mew, makes it much safer around path, and just in opening hand, goodness of getting your combo. It's a big reason why Sparkle Mew has made a bit of a resurgence in the format after being far weaker than DTE before this set. So, yeah, very, very strong card. And I think going forward, that's not going to change. There's even the Arven supporter card coming out from Scarlet and Violet, which is really going to take advantage of this. And also, if there's going to be Radiant Eternatus decks using VMAX engines, or just a VMAX focus of a deck, they could easily take advantage of a Grove Tablet as well, because they're unlikely to have a V-Star power. So I think even more versatile, more options for it in the future formats to come. Brandon, obviously terrible card. Candice, obviously terrible card. Furisode Girl, we're going to put down to that 1-star. I don't think any control variant has actually utilised this sort of supporter. Kind of too niche, kind of too narrow. You may as well just draw cards and dig deeper into your deck. Essentially, most of the combos based around control is getting to a point where you're at the bottom of your deck and cycling stuff, and the Furisode doesn't really help you get there too much. Lance is going to be that 1-star card. Regidrago in general just flopped. And this was going to try and be that kind of face of the Drago deck, maybe. I think it was mostly really Gardenia that was going to be the face of the Regidrago deck. Both of them have their own issues. But yeah, and don't think there's any interesting dragon types coming out from the new set. Obviously, Eternatus is easy enough to find with just the likes of Quick Balls, so no real reason to expect more Lance in future. Laventon is terrible. Serena is certainly going to be that 5-star card. I mean, everyone knew it was coming. It was much more of a split between Serena and Boss as the format developed, because Lost Box pretty much took all the better percentage of Giratina. Like, Giratina was one of the most popular decks pre-Tempest, right? But that got completely munched up by another one-prize deck. So with Reggie and with Lost Box being so popular, there was a lot of reason to have Boss. And I actually think a lot of my early Lugias was very Serena-focused until we got to this point where there was enough Lost Box that Stoutland was just too important to not play. And that means, of course, you need to play Boss so you can capitalize on the smaller things. So it is more of a split between things, and there are some decks that would still choose to play purely Boss's orders, but there's no doubt we're going to continue to see this split as the format develops. Even into Scarlet and Violet, there'll still be enough V and V star Pokemon that there will be Serenas. I just think now is kind of the amount of time where it'll be at its highest counts, and then we'll kind of chip lower and lower back towards Boss as EX decks make their way into the game in Scarlet and Violet. Wallace, obviously terrible. Worker, I think I actually did see some experimentation. I know Eric Smith played it in his Zorro deck. I think it was a day 2 placement with his deck. That was some experimentation. I don't really think it's made its way into Reggie's. It's not made its way into Lost Box. People are just playing Birdkeeper as their one-of like bonus supporter instead. And Gudra's kind of fallen off the map. So although there are some pretty important Stadium Wars going on, I don't think the Worker is the right move for the majority of decks. I think more people are looking towards Lost Vacuum to give you that mix and match of being a stadium bounce, but also sometimes tool removal, which can be helpful. I think that's more or less taken precedence over Worker, and we just have just very good supporters in general in the game. And even then, we have low counts in many decks, like Lost Boxes are playing like 7 supporters, Lugia is playing like 11, something like that. So We're on low counts, so the worker doesn't really get a look in. You would just add to the power supporters first before this ever gets a chance. Onto Primordial Altar. I may bump this up to 2-star, but I think it's probably too generous. There was some of this going around alongside, like I said, that Guru in some Zoro builds to allow you to force more things into that discard pile or just cycle through your deck. Just giving yourself that extra information can sometimes be valuable before using your make-dos or whatnot. So, yeah, seems like a reasonable card. I think in general it's still outclassed by Pokestop and Trekking Shoes. But, yeah, it's like an option, and I think probably post-rotation it's something that Lugia has to play, which won't feel good. You might even end up playing this. You never really know, but it's sort of between that 1.5 and 2, where it had a couple of bits of play, but let's be honest, it's outclassed by other stadiums right now. Regen Energy, very poor. I don't really see a reason for this to see any more play. Interestingly, it could be a combination card alongside, again, Gardevoir EX, where you can damage like a Shadow Rider, and then attach this regenerative for turn attachment, and then evolve up into a VMAX and heal the damage you just put on. So there may be some combos here, but nothing right now in standard. V-Guard, very, very strong card. 5 may be overdoing it because it's sort of that in and out of Lugia. It's not really seeing any play in Blissey, and Gudra's kind of died, so it's limited to like essentially exactly Lugia and a very small percentage of Mews. I guess those are still some of the strongest decks in the game, so we'll keep it at that 5-star status, but again, we've gone so one-prizey. Lugia is essentially like a one-prize deck for half the game, and then Lost Box and Regis don't care about this card, so it's kind of like a sub 50% in Lugias, I would say, these days, but that's still probably good enough to be that 5-star status, and this being a card in the format has been warping in its own right, by being a hurdle for Mew players, by being one of the things sort of pushing Tina out of the meta that little bit, pushing Palkia into a weird shape rather than it being the sort of aggressive 2-prizer that it used to be. So it was influential, even though it's not seeing as much play in the latter stages of this format. So there's the summary. I think we were pretty close on everything, to be honest. I guess the jelly excitement for 1 week was the only thing we were kind of a little bit off on. Overall, pretty not bad on the trainer front. Let's go on to the V and VSTAR Pokemon. Chestnut, obviously terrible. Superior, obviously terrible. People were quite excited about this card, but yeah, useless. Omastar, obviously terrible. Vulpix, we kind of overrated, in line with the community for the most part. Basically, Kyurem Palkia really suffered. It still had a couple of day 2 placements, and I think this was the only deck where I was expecting it to see any play in the first place, where it fits that niche similar to like a Drapion, where the Silver Snow Star would give you a one-hit KO into Mew, but then you have the added benefits of like having a Wall Breaker to get through Miltank, so you didn't have to play Drapion and Empoleon, you could play this 1/1 Vulpix instead, whilst being annoying in Mirror. But of course, there weren't any mirrors to speak of, so that didn't matter. There was still Mew, obviously, but Kyurem Palkia just had other issues in the game that I had to deal with, namely just being bad into Lugia. So there wasn't really a stage for Alolan Vulpix to really kick off and do things. I don't think the card is like necessarily inherently that bad, it's just it didn't really have that home. So we're going to bump it down to the 1-star because really, Kyurem Palkia went from being like a top 5 deck in popularity to just being off the face of the earth. Pretty incredible just for one set to change that much. It's been a very short-lived life cycle for Kyurem Palk, and Vulpix is a victim of that. Regieleki, I think 3 is kind of fair, possibly as low as 2-star, where it was mostly this experimental deck in the early stages, but Vikavolt has come on in leaps and bounds in this format, where it's won a regional alongside Palkia, and then it's come second in a regional alongside like Ditto, Toolboxy, 2-prizers, and Aerodactyl of all things. So Vikavolt was right in just being a very good card in this format. It's just the Transistor is too much clunk and too much clutter that actually hurts getting that paralyzing bolt off early, or hurts that early Lightning Rondo pressure. And we actually needed other things to be in and around our deck instead, basically just speedy cards instead, like just maxing out on Shoes and Mews and Greninja and Nets and such. So the Regieleki probably down to like 2-star. Now there could still be a late sweep of a Lecky Vikavolt, because I do think there are still reasons to really like Paralyzing Bolt, and we're still seeing more things come out of the woodwork with this card, and just buffing your damage output in general is not inherently a bad thing. So there could still be time for a late Lecky Vikavolt deck to do pretty well. I think our initial like builds of having that 3/3 or 4/3 Aleki is just wrong. It's too many spaces, but possibly like a 2/2 line of Aleki is reasonable in the deck because it does still offer you a decent amount of value. So we'll pump it down to that 2-star where it has had online placements, just not done much IRL, and it was definitely experimented with quite a lot. Onto Unknown. This is terrible, obviously. Morwile, yeah, again, pretty bad. We already had Leafeon in the game, and it wasn't seeing any play, and that was also had a really good basic, which this one doesn't have, and the Gust effect was much more flexible, whereas this one forces the Morwile active, which would force you to then switch back out, or just do very poor damage with Sudden Eater, so yeah, very bad card overall, and we didn't need Psychic type coverage as well, which I guess is one thing to note, where some people may have given this a nod as like a tech card that Arceus could play if it was worried about Urshifu, but that's just not the world we were living in. Arcanine, yeah, too much work for what you're actually getting out of this card. Drago. So this was weird. We were very negative on the all-Dragon Drago deck, but we were quite high on Arc Drago. Casting your minds back to pre-Silver Tempest, Arc Tina was actually doing pretty well, and I actually played it at a regional. Really did think that Arc Tina had legs at the time, and I thought Drago was really going to hand that... Tina was going to hand that mantle over to Drago, where you had the Giratina pressure when you needed it, but you could also be rolling ironing into one prize matchups, which still is reasonable, but I just don't think it has enough into Lugia. Essentially, that's the big issue, right? The tempo of just being this all two prize deck just isn't correct when you're having to use that Lost Impact, and if the Lugias were playing V-Guard Energy, that would be terrible for you, and the fact that they just have one hit KO potential via one prizes was really bad because this deck wasn't good at playing one prizes of its own outside of Big Barrel. So I think there are just big issues with the Drago. I'll probably put it down to 2-star. There was experimentation, myself included, with it, but I don't think it's had any high placements. I actually have high hopes for Drago, like post-rotation. I think it does have a lot of legs, and it loses a lot less than other things in the game that are going massively down in power level, whereas this one kind of stays where it was. So I don't think Drago is going to be a flop its entire life. It could end up being that way, but I don't mind its flexibility going forward. We always knew that the rating was going to be terrible on the like pure Drago Dragon deck because we tested that more than anything else, but I still gave this the higher rating just for an Arceus PAL, and turned out this was one of the formats where Arceus PALs really didn't do too much. It was basically Arc Dura which survived, and basically every other Arc has fallen by the wayside. That might not be forever though. There could still be some room for Flying Peak in the formats. There could be room for a few other tech Pokemon in here, but I don't think Drago is going to be the one because it just adds extra steps to your game plan, which was also a bit of a headache for this deck, where it had quite a fragile early game, and basically Starburst fixed everything, and sometimes you would continue to be fragile through the mid-game, and having those extra steps to discard these guys just made it a little bit too much work. Onto Ho-Oh. We'll put it down to 1-star. It still has bags of potential, and I'm always wary of effects like this because there could be a combo deck that just works, and that could be the case going forward in future, because we do still have a very powerful engine of discard and cycle, but there's nothing that can really take advantage of it just yet, so we'll put it down to 1-star. I don't even think there has been experimentation with it at all. Lugia, the most obvious 5-star of your life. We had the Aurora stuff and the 3 main attackers. We had the colourless stuff with Stoutland poking out there in the top right corner. The single strike stuff was basically just a Japanese thing that didn't really translate over too much. But we're showcasing all the right special energies, which is cool, and yeah, the deck continues to really thrive. And I don't see it going anywhere. In Crown Zenith meta, of course, it loses a ton to rotation. And the bulk Vs were just that. There's no reason to even think about these cards seeing play, and there still isn't. So again, not too bad. I think the Vulpix and Aleki were both kind of overrated that little bit. And the Drago is kind of just, again, a victim of basically Lugia being like an 8-star card on the scale, which then just sort of invalidated so much else. I think you could also say that about the Vulpix, right? Kieran Palkia was a fairly successful deck in the previous format, and it just gets wiped off the face of the earth, as does most Arceus decks get wiped off the face. So you can see why we made those ratings, but yeah, ultimately, Lugia just ate up so much meta share that not much else really had a look in. Onto the single price stuff then. Amoonguss obviously terrible. There's not even actually an activator for this. I was trying to talk about discarding cards, but none of them actually discard Amoonguss from hand, so yeah, awful. Ariados we rated really high, and again, this is just testament to Lugia, how much it munched up that meta share. At the time that I was reading Ariados, I was thinking how it was annoying for Palkia players, Arceus players, Tina players, and a little bit of headache for Lugia players. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking there's going to be so much Serena in this format that maybe this Ariados stays in play for a few turns and grants you that value. Well, let's look at the complexion of the format now. Among the top decks, the only V-Star is Lugia, and it doesn't even need to attack. Like, throughout the entire game, it doesn't need to attack, so this String of Shade really isn't doing too much. Even controlling decks won't be using a card like this, even with, like, Level Ball and whatnot. We actually saw Durant do pretty well, even in one regional, and it had no need to play this Ariados. It used its board for other things, like Venusaur and such. So, yeah, this was not the direction that Lost Box went. I'm not necessarily angry or upset or like surprised that it did necessarily that badly. This was one that would have had a huge payoff if I was right. And it just is not the direction the format ended up going. Again, it just makes me think what a crazy shift we've had just from one deck taking up so much meta share. It's gone from like 5 viable V-Stars in the game to 1 viable V-Star in the game, and Ariados just isn't worth countering Lugia, because again, they just use other attackers throughout the entire time. And again, thanks to Lost Box being one of the best one prize decks, it also punishes Ariados being around because its hit points are just too low. Serena, we actually have to give a slightly higher rating because of Sander and his lovely Gengar Guardi Mewtwo V Union deck. So we'll give this, what would you say? Probably 2-star for experimentation that worked by one person and his brain being huge. Very cool combo from Sander. I'm not necessarily sure that the Mewtwo deck is all that safe, to be honest. The aggressive attacking Mewtwo deck going forward, so I wouldn't expect it to have any more placements in this format. So we'll give it to Sander. Tip your cap to him. He made a cool one and done deck. Outside of that, not too much to be said about Serena. Braixen, we actually have to give this a higher rating as well because Zorobox is a deck in the format. I kind of just wrote this off as being a Zoro card because I thought it would take up too much space to have these 4 Serenas, and I thought we had more specific, strong stage 1s that could just fill those gaps. But Braixen really is this card that just means that if you prize certain things, or if you get something hit with Lost City, you still have a valid attacker no matter what you're up against, no matter how your opponent plays their board, you have a little bit of stable damage in your deck. And just playing 4 Serena wasn't necessarily that bad for Zoro either. So we'll give this a 3-star, with Zoro being like a pretty decent deck in the format, and Braixen being in almost all of those. So yeah, not a bad card overall. Going forward, I don't think there's going to be too much difference as we go into the Zenith meta. Rapidash, pretty poor. There are no like pure fire decks, and this needs to be in a pure fire deck to see any value. Articuno. So we rated 2 stars. We saw the potential, and we knew that Palkia, if it was going to have legs, it was going to be this sort of defense mode. We were thinking Roxanne and late game para. Cross your fingers that they don't find the outs, but what we failed to see was that Lugia just didn't play outs. By the time we were making this Silver Tempest list, we didn't know that Lugia was going to continue to play basically no outs throughout all of LAIC, and then going into that there was going to be this cycle where you could punish them with paralysis. So I guess this was always going to be that sort of wait and see how the meta falls kind of card, so I don't think there was anything we could have done outside of giving a nod to paralysis being good. But the fact that you didn't need to use this alongside hand disruption because the opponent's deck just didn't have an answer was a bit of an oversight, I guess you could say. So we will bump this up to 3-star, where again, Palkia's like jelly deck has been in the spotlight. It's done its thing. I don't know if it can be repeated again. Now, recently in the previous regional, there was the winning list only played 1 Birdkeeper and no other outs, so there is still a possibility for a jelly deck to do well, because Lugias don't want to commit the space to this much more. So there is still hope for the deck. I do think it is still a bit of a gambit, though, a bit of a gimmick more than anything else from this point on. Now that it's, before it was actually played at an event, it was, a great way to cash in on deck lists, and having your finger on the pulse is a way that you can use cards like this to exploit gaps in the meta, I guess you could say. But now that gap is kind of being filled by enough people being aware of it, that it's not going to change too much or make as many splashes as it did with those deep runs. Onto Raichu, we'll give this again, bumping it all the way up to the 3-star. I think you have to have some massive cojones to play Zoro in the format with the amount of Lost Box that is in the meta. And this was always a thing that was telling me, like, oh, Zoro can't ever be a good deck if Lost Box is going to be in that top 3 or 4 decks in the game. And that's exactly the issue of Zoroark, right? You can make deep runs if you just dodge them, but you still have an inherent top 3 deck that you basically can never beat. But the Raichu is very good into Lugia, and that's a good enough reason to play the cards. So we'll give it that 3-star for being a decent card in that list. Medicham, we will give that 1-star. Even Zoro decks don't want to play this. There's no reason to play a Psychic type. And there aren't many VMAXs outside of Mew, which you have Myciana for already. Radiant Alakazam. Again, we can give that 2-star nod for being a card in the Intel Articuno Jelly deck. But I think ultimately it's probably worse than Greninja anyway. Just drawing more cards is usually the best option. So yeah, maybe that 2-star nod just for that deck. But outside of that, I don't think it's doing too much else. Jinx, we rated very high, and it's not even seen a little bit of play. Absolutely insane when you think about it. But again, it's just the fact that the V-decks aren't pure V-decks these days. So when you actually just take a knockout on this card, it's really, really bad. So, yeah, it turns out the format was just right, that we didn't really care about this card. And I think it only gets worse as we move into a EX meta, so all the way down to 1-star. Pretty insane. Again, just the complexion of the format previously, being this headache, throwing it out there with rock sands and stuff, forcing Gust or forcing your opponent to build an attacker all in a turn, sounded very promising for getting some free damage in, but it's just not getting the job done in this case. Curly Agadi, we gave 2-star, and Sander did end up playing this card, so 2 stars pretty much on the money. It still is outclassed by Cincino in the Zoro decks because you have 10 more hit points on the Cincino, you have a decent attack on the Cincino, and the Mincino gives you a Call for Family attack. So it is still pretty much outclassed in that regard, which was my main argument for this not seeing more play. But the fact that you can evolve from Refine into Shining Arcana is very, very strong, in that you can see a lot of cards then net up your Guardi as well, even, and re-evolve into other stuff, and you can have a big burst of draw, which is very powerful. And of course, this card is going to see so much play when Guardi EX comes out. It's going to be a whole thing. This deck seems nuts on paper. So get your Curliers now while they're still cheap. There's even pre-release ones, so yeah, try and get those. It's going to be pretty epic, I think. Meowstic, we'll give that 1-star. Yeah, no real reason to see this. Claydol, just like Arcanine, no real reason to play the deck. Donphan, terrible. Radiant Jirachi, we can give that 3-star treatment that the community were mostly behind, actually, to be fair to them. Because it ended up being in the Zoro deck, which is a tiered deck, I want to say. And it actually turned out that Glimwood Twin Carrier was an entire combo. I basically had on the slides exactly what I thought was going to be happening with Jirachi. I just was skeptical that it was right. But it does give you ways of beating things like Arcdura and other annoying walls that Zoro otherwise just can't get around. So, yeah, it gives you win conditions. It sometimes gives you cheesy dubs even into like Mew and such. So, actually a decent option, which is pretty insane. It even helps Zoro against like item lock. So, pretty crazy card. I think, again, it continues to only be in Zoro. But as Zoro's a deck, we got to give it the 3-star treatment. Kling Clang will give 1-star. We have better acceleration. It's called Mirage Gates. Dragonites, yeah, this can go all the way down to 1. The Draco deck did terribly. Altaria, we also have to put down to 1-star. Like I was saying earlier, tanking kind of got invalidated that little bit, with Lugia having amazing rare Yveltal, and Lost Box having amazing rare Rayquaza. So there is just no tanking going on in the game outside of Mewtwo, I guess. And Mewtwo's not going to play a card like this because it just gets picked off or whatever earlier on before the Mewtwo comes into play. So there's just no real home for the Altaria. I thought this effect was going to be actually really strong. It's just the format went from a 2-shot format to let's blow up anything in our path. So yeah, bit of a bad timing for this Altaria to come out, really. And Archeops, yeah, we know that this card's incredible. We've already talked about it to death, and you're probably bored of seeing it at this point, but it's, yeah, just unfathomable energy acceleration. Everyone knew this was going to be a 5-star, and I think they're still surprised at how good this deck ended up being. The meta share is absolutely bananas right now for Lugia, and I don't see it changing too much. It has the stuff in the format to be a problem even for the counter decks in various forms that we've seen now, so it'll continue to do very well, and it's basically a question of how do you tech it correctly each week in order to see the most success with this deck and still respect the mirror enough and make sure you still get into the game enough just with having your responsible amount of outs to all of your things throughout every game that you play with the deck. So yeah, that is going to be the one prizes. I think overall, a big miss on the Ariados, just a general miss on Lost Boxing, I guess, where I wasn't really anticipating a big shift towards Mirage Gate builds, because there was a huge resistance to play Mirage Gate builds pre-Tempest. I wonder if we went back to Lost Origins meta now and looked at more Mirage Gate builds and would have actually played them at regionals, because there was a big hesitancy back then to play with these sorts of cards, and everyone was happy enough just playing Zard. Whereas as we fast forward into the Tempest meta, you couldn't just sit on your laurels as a Lost Box. You had to have instant impact responses to Stoutland, which I guess is the catalyst for all these Mirage Gate builds. But I think just the inherent strengths of the Mirage Gate stuff was already apparent. I think there was just a big resistance for that to be a deck. So I guess in that regard, I undersold how Lost Box was going to be adapting. I thought Ariados was going to give this deck time to, breathe against these V-Star decks and just get over the line with cram hits and sables as we reach the Zard over and over again and give yourself some extra disruption, whereas we've gone head down, get to 7 as quick as possible, gates to be able to one-shot through whatever we need to is pretty much the main thing here. Outside of that, a little bit soft on Zoro, where the Jirachi and Raichu need a bit of love, and yeah, more or less not too bad. A few things that we got a little bit awry, but overall, I think all reasonable, and I've tried to explain at least our logic at the time and how it went wrong. But yeah, look out for a mini set review of this set. I'm also going to put in the description a community review, so please go ahead and do that for Crown Zenith. It's going to be very short, much shorter than normal set reviews, so it should be really easy for you guys to complete, and that'll be out in the next couple of days. So thanks so much for watching. I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.